Welcome to First Baptist Church in Sweetwater, Texas. We join in with our pastor, Jerry Hendricks, for this week's message.
One of the things that I realize the older I get, that more of life is about defining moments. And if you've lived for very long, you realize that they kind of began to multiply over a period of time. 1988 was a defining moment for Sharon and I. We had lived in Houston for about 3.5 years. We accepted the call to a church at First Baptist Church in Texas City, Texas. Texas City, Texas is on the Galveston Bay, 15 miles north of Galveston. And so we moved there. We started the year in 1988 in a new ministry. We made the move, you figured that out, during Christmas while Sharon was 7 months pregnant. And so we got ready, we got our feet on the ground there and got ready to go. In February of 1988, our son was born. So we celebrated that. Went through the first summer in a new student ministry with a lot of things that were going on that were really exciting as we had the opportunity to develop relationships with students and teachers and parents in that church. And then in September 1988, before or right as the school year was starting, there was a tropical depression that began to form in the Gulf. Now, Sharon grew up in California in a farming community in the middle of the state. I grew up in Mundy, Texas, far from water. We weren't familiar with this. We'd had one hurricane come into the Gulf when we lived in Houston, and really it was just an excuse to go to the grocery store, buy a bunch of stuff, and have a party. We learned that you party before a hurricane comes. That was kind of new to us as well. But we knew that this storm was different. It was intensifying. It hit Jamaica at a Category 3. It came across Jamaica and came into the Gulf, and that's when things got serious, particularly for those of us on the Gulf Coast. It began to increase in intensity, and before long, it reached Category 5. Now, you know that the one that just hit the coast for us was a Category 4, and it reached that just in those last moments before it made landfall, and you see the catastrophic results of that. So we start talking to people and trying to figure out what we're supposed to do. James is 7 months old. We're in a brand new house, the first house that we had ever owned, and we have to make a decision. Hurricanes are different. I don't know if you've ever been in that culture, in that environment. When you look at that, it's a period of days where there's a series of events that happens where you don't know what's going to happen or where things are going to go. There's only one way out from Texas City, Texas, and Galveston. That's I-45, straight up through one of the largest cities in the world, Houston. So we called some friends, decided to go to Houston, at least be on higher ground if the water came in. You hear all kinds of stories and people are talking about it and you don't know what to do. But I recall vividly going home for lunch those days prior to us evacuating, where all you would hear, the silence, the scary silence, was only broken by the noise in our neighborhood of skill saws sawing plywood to cover windows. So all these people that we were familiar with that grew up in that area who had ridden out storms before, this one was different. They were taking it seriously. Things start to cancel. If you have children down there, you know how this goes. By Thursday, I think, they had already canceled schools in most of the Houston school area. Church was already canceled by Thursday before it ever happened on Sunday. And so you sit and you wait, and all the time you're sort of riveted to the television while you watch this thing slowly move what you think may be toward you. As you get to those last moments, we decided to go ahead and go on into Houston, so we packed up our car. So for the first time in our young married life, well, we've been married for a while, but we walked through our house and we basically asked ourselves this question: what are you comfortable with never seeing again? We didn't have a minivan. We didn't have a Suburban. I think at the time we just had a 2-door car. We loaded up that car. We set the rest of the stuff that we could on counters and tables and cabinets so that maybe when the water rose that it would be safe. The defining moment for us was this. What's going to matter most? When it's all said and done, what's going to matter most? As it turns out, that Category 5 hurricane continued to come into the Gulf and only touched the very tip of Texas. It hit the Yucatan Peninsula there north of, or in the northern part of Mexico and just south of Texas. When we drove back into town, and it was a town of about 45,000 people, and it was like a ghost town. You didn't see cars driving around. We drove into town, and we never received one drop of rain. Defining moments are not necessarily that dramatic, but they do occur, and they occur over a lifetime with some regularity where God gets our attention. This morning, I want us to look at the ministry of Jesus and a defining moment in his life. And if you have a text this morning, we're going to read in just a minute from Mark chapter 3. The text will also be on the screen so that you can read along with us. When you look at the ministry of Jesus, one of the things that you understand in his life is that his ministry, just like ours, is a series of defining moments. And we have the opportunity to look into his life and to capture what it is that he's beginning to think and how it is that he's beginning to shape his ministry. There comes that place in his ministry where it's defined by the message and the ministry merging onto the same path. Jesus came and he had a clear message. That message would be one that became clearer and clearer the longer that he lived, up until the moment of his death, and his ministry began to take shape as well. But in the moment that we read here in just a second, what we see is the ministry and the message merging along the same path, and for two very good reasons. When Jesus came, we needed to know that the message of Jesus would endure. That the message of Jesus that he came to share with people and to declare to people would not be a message that would go away once his life had gone away. The second thing is that we needed to make sure that the message of Jesus would be one that would spread. Really, eventually, we would desire that the message would spread exponentially, because at that time, all we had was the verbal testimony of people. We didn't have a way to print up the message and to send it out in that kind of way. And so the way that the message would be shared with people would be by others sharing that message. So as that path begins to merge and his ministry and his message come together, he does what we read in Mark chapter 3. He calls together those who were following him. And he does this, reading in verse 13. It says that Jesus went up on a mountainside, and he called to them those that he wanted. And they came to him. And he appointed 12 that might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. And then verses 16 and on, we see the names of those that Jesus called out. The message of Christianity and the ministry of Christianity begins to take shape at the moment that Jesus calls out those disciples, because it's going to be a defining moment for them as well. As they have the opportunity to embrace what Jesus has done in them, and they've transitioned, listen to this, they've transitioned from merely being a follower to being a leader. We use the word leadership in church occasionally. I may use the word leadership in church more than most. And regardless of how it is that you want to frame that word leadership in the life of the church, really what we're talking about is that opportunity that we have when we move from being a follower to a disciple, and we assume the role that God's called us to in this life. We begin to, in our own life, determine whether it's through defining events or however it is that God moves in us, where we begin to see a path, and that path becomes clearer for us as a person who chooses to follow Jesus. One of the things about this passage that I think is striking is this, is that when we're on this path, we first recognize the path as a relational path. Jesus calls those and he performs ministry in front of them, and they begin to follow him, and they begin to get acquainted with Jesus. They begin to know him. Many of them got to spend time with him, and it was up close and personal time. That had to be special. Or maybe if it wasn't one of those who was closest to him, maybe you were close enough that when you saw Jesus perform a miracle, he was just within sight, and you saw it happen right before your very eyes. We begin on this path as a relational path. This morning, my hope is that everyone that's in this room today has started out on that relational path with Jesus. Jesus eventually makes it very clear that he came to die for our sins. That path is difficult for us. It's not a path that we can attain on our own. That the only way that we can connect this path to God and what God has planned for us is if we accept his payment for the sin in our life. Jesus became our sacrifice. This relational path is a significant path. And when we think about it, we cannot take it lightly. But we do hope, we encourage everyone to join us on this path of knowing Jesus. This path of accepting what Jesus has done for us. And we move into this relational path, and as we go down this relational path, we begin to discover things. Things begin to merge in our life where one path comes into this one, and we have the opportunity to say yes for those next things that God has called us to or that God has called us toward. And just like the disciples, we have that opportunity to move along this path and move from being just a follower of Jesus to being a disciple of Jesus. Here's something I find interesting. There are a lot of people who really enjoy the relational path. They enjoy the relational path with Jesus, knowing that when they die, they'll spend eternity in heaven, that they never engage Jesus on that next path. That path of being a disciple of his. That path of saying yes. That path of hearing your name called out and knowing it's time for you to step into this new kind of relationship, this deeper relationship, and going down a path that's going to be unlike any other that you could have. If you've just been happy with yourself being on that relational path, what I want to tell you this morning is this. There is so much more. There is so much more. And the disciples were about to find this out as Jesus calls them together, because when he calls them together, here's what he says: I want to send you out. This new path for you as my disciple is this. You're going to start telling people about me. You're going to take the message that I shared with you, the message that you hear me teaching people, and you're going to carry that into the world. Not only that, as you go, I'm going to do something for you that you've not experienced yet. Here it is. I'm going to give you my authority. They had been along this path for a good while. They understood this relational path. They had had fun on this relational path, and I want to believe that Jesus was a fun person to be around. But as they moved into this discipleship path, he said, you're going to go into this path and you're going to share the message that I've shared, and you're going to do it with something that you've never experienced before in your life: God's authority. You think that path's scary? They have God's authority. Have you just been happy with a relational path and not stepped into a path that's going to require God's authority in your life? Sometimes these paths emerge for us and we never take the opportunity to take that step in that new path that God has developed for our life. Let me share a couple of things with you. The intent, if you have your outline sheet, I wrote it out there. The intent of following is to eventually lead. The disciples found this to be true, and Jesus called them out and prepared them for a special assignment. The path that we're on, the intent of it is never just to continue to follow, but it's to prepare us. Some of that preparation is us having the opportunity to hear what Jesus is saying, to see what Jesus is doing. But however it is that we create, or God creates for us these defining moments in our life, eventually that following comes to a point of leading. That's the place the disciples found themselves in as they prepared this. The determining your leadership capacity, I believe, is one of the first steps of discovering the fullness of this leadership path. Because here's what might happen also. We have people in the life of the church who are happy just moving along on this relational path, never saying yes to discipleship, never opening their eyes up to those new opportunities or those new paths that God may place in their life. But then there are some that do. And once you get on that path, here's our responsibility. It's to discover how it is that God has uniquely wired us so that we might reach our full potential as a disciple of His. We don't want to miss the mark. There's too much riding on it. There's too many people depending upon it. Our families may be depending upon it. Future generations may be depending upon it. God is depending upon it as He uses us as His disciples to spread the word throughout the world. We have that responsibility. We want to take that responsibility and to work it into our life, where we might reach the full potential that God has uniquely wired us to have. That requires some responsibility on our part. It requires some work on our part, some intentionality as we begin to take shape of our life and take control of the things that God has uniquely equipped us to do and the person that God has uniquely equipped us to be. That's the first step in that leadership path. What about the next steps? When you take the first step, the next steps automatically become clearer to you. But you have to take the first step. You have to move out into that next place before you can begin to understand the future steps that God has for you. There are many joys to being able to be a Christian for as long as I've been a Christian. But when you think about your life over a period of years and you think about how God has helped you develop your faith, you see over and over and over those specific paths that God led you on, those specific paths that God prepared you for. And then maybe sometimes God will even give you a glimpse of the results of some of those paths that you took. He'll let you see some of the fruit from the path that He uniquely equipped you for and you said yes to. The intent of following is to eventually lead. But here's what I want us to think of this morning, is that leadership is intentional and it becomes a part of the why. Now let me think about, I want you to think about what it means to be intentional right now. We want to discover for ourselves what path we're on. Is it a relational path? Is it a discipleship path? Is it a leadership path? Is it a ministry path? What does that path look like for you this morning? How is it beginning to shift and take shape? Is it looking different than it did just a year ago? Or how is it different than it was 5 years ago? Or maybe you're new in faith and every day to you is brand new. Look at the path that God has placed you on. And then intentionally begin to look for the merging of future paths. Once we begin to wire ourselves this way and we immerse ourselves in some of the characteristics of faith, like learning how to pray and spending time in prayer with God, learning how to read our Bible and to know God through Scripture, sharing the testimony of Christ that God has shared with us, once we begin to practice all of these things that are a part of being faith, then those future paths for us become clearer and clearer. But we need to be intentional about it. We need to prepare for it. We don't want to be blindsided by a path that God has uniquely prepared us for. We want to be ready. I never in my life wanted to miss an opportunity that God provided for me because I was unprepared. One of the motivating factors in my discipleship was just that. That I would always be prepared, that I would always be ready, that my faith would be in the kind of shape that anytime God says, this is what I have for you next, I would be ready. Leadership is intentional, and it becomes part of the why. We're not used to asking about the why a lot. Now, we may be asked why, but we are not used to asking the why. For instance, why does God let you draw the next breath? I mean, is it possible that we are alive today because God has a purpose for our life? Is it possible that there is a why in our life that God has tried to make clear to us but we've not quite yet understood? We need to live our life in the why. We need to understand why God has placed us here. We need to moved on to that path to see how that path goes for us, and God will make it clearer and clearer to us as we go down that path. We also need to ask ourselves the why of church. Why do we exist? We go to a lot of trouble week in, week out to do this. Why do we do that? Why do we have a kickoff Sunday? Or why do we have worship? Or why do we spend time planning music and having a time together where we sing songs and hear a message preached? Why do we do that? Why do we exist? I think Jesus demonstrates for us why we exist. At one point, under criticism, he said this, that the sick don't need, the healthy don't need a doctor, the sick need doctors. And with that in mind, I came to seek and to save those that were lost. Those that had not yet joined me on this relational path. Jesus said, of all the things that he came to do, he came to teach, he came to heal, he came to develop relationships and work with the disciples. But the one thing that he had to do in order for his life to be on purpose was to seek and to save the lost. If you erase that from his resume, all he was another teacher or another healer or another speaker. He stayed on the path. And that path has led us to a relationship with him, to responsibility in that relationship, and to opportunity in that relationship. The why for us is somewhat varied. The way we go about answering the why is varied. And there's a lot of ways that we get to that. But the one thing, whether we sing or preach or help, the one thing that we have to be about in our life as a disciple and as a church is seeking and saving those who've not heard and not joined us in this relationship. So here's what he did. He basically said, look, you don't accidentally become a leader. You don't just kind of stumble into that. When you join Jesus on that relationship path, at some point there's a defining moment for you and you say, I'm going to be totally committed to this. I'm giving my life to this. I'm going to be a leader. I'm going to be a disciple. However it is that you need to frame that. And once we say that, here's what happens in our life. He says we go to seek those and to send those. You are not the last person who Jesus will send. But the next person that God wants to send may be through you. We have to own this responsibility that we have as disciples of Jesus. And maybe it's oversimplified, but I believe that it starts with yes. Yes. Yes to that path. Yes to that opportunity. At the start of a new year, some have already been in school for a while and some start tomorrow, but it's kind of that rhythm for us where he says we're starting now. My prayer is that we will have everyone in this room respond by saying yes. Let me pray.
Thank you for joining us at First Baptist Church. We hope you can join us again, online or in person, in Sweetwater, Texas, as we learn to live out God's calling in the world around us.